like, again, it comes down to preparation, and I think athletes need to really take ownership of it. And like a young student athlete should be, if they can do, tell their parents what to what to buy them and what to prepare for them, but ideally take ownership of your own performance. You know, I think all ages, if you really want it, you've got to seek it, because parents and guardians don't always know that's the best thing for you to have, and that's probably why your audience are listening to this right now, because they want to get better.
And he's here. He is here. Cristiano has entered the building. Welcome, wherever you are, to the Old Trafford Theatre.
Yes, guys, welcome back to today's episode of Sculpted. Today, we have Ted Munson on here, and it's an honor to have him on. I have Ted on LinkedIn, which is how I got in touch with him, and Ted works as a nutritionist in sports, and it's a really interesting topic for all of us today to listen to. Ted's experiences in nutrition, the people who he's worked with, and we really, really need to, as footballers, as people who are working in sports, as business people who are listening, nutrition is something, and it's something that's very important to help you get the most out of what you're doing in day-to-day life, help you sculpt yourself by 1%, 2%, maybe even more, because nutrition is something where you really can take the next step in your performance, take it to the next level. So that being said, really excited to get Ted on today. And Ted, if you can just give us a bit of background on yourself and who you are, what you stand for, that'd be great.
Oh yeah, so firstly, Nick, Val, thank you very much for having me on. I love doing these sort of things because don't always get the opportunity, and I think you kind of just hit the nail on the head with that introduction right there of like the importance of nutrition. Certainly, well, not just for athletic individuals, but for anyone who is interested in having a high performance lifestyle. So yeah, like I said, my name's Ted. I've been a performance nutritionist for 9 years now, coming up to 10. I graduated from University of Hull back in 2014, sport and exercise science. To be honest, back then I didn't have a clue what I wanted to do. I just knew I wanted to work in elite sport in some capacity, whether that be I was interested in like performance analysis, strength and conditioning, fitness coaching. To be honest, nutrition never really it wasn't really like a thing back then in professional sports. Back in 2014, there was like 4 nutritionists working in the Premier League, which was crazy. Didn't even like bat an eyelid about it. But I was really lucky. After I graduated, I bought a sports science internship, and at the time that was at Hull City Football Club. So that was back in the Steve Bruce era, 2014 to 2016. So Premier League, back down to the Championship, and then back up to the Premier League. So it was that was a huge experience for me. Just straight in the thick of it after university, and during that time I was doing a master's in sport and exercise science, where I focused on publishing a couple of papers in hydration, even though I kind of didn't it was in nutrition, but it wasn't technically like a sport and exercise nutrition master's. It was technically sports science. But that's where it was at Hull City where I really found like that nutrition has a huge impact on performance. Also, kind of more so than any other aspect of sports science that those guys were doing on a day-to-day basis. And I was lucky enough to work with some of the best athletes there that we know of today. People like Harry Maguire, Andy Robertson. They were all at Hull City then. And we even had like Hatem Ben Arfa coming in and out, and I learned a lot about high performance individuals there, and I learned a lot about myself as well, about what I was good at, and kind of what I was bad at as well, and what I needed to work on. So after I did my masters there, knew the nutrition was what I wanted to work on. So I did to become a registered sport and exercise nutritionist. I had to then go and do further education on top of my masters. So I did a postgraduate in sport and exercise nutrition at Leeds Beckett University, which is a really good university here in the UK for nutrition. And I was already kind of practicing a bit as a nutritionist there, but I needed that qualification to get on the sport and exercise nutrition register, which we'll probably go into a little more detail later. But that is basically anyone who is fully qualified in nutrition is registered under the British Dietetics Association. Certainly over here, I know in the US they have their own version, and certainly in Australia have their own version as well. But that's you can technically do a 3-day course and call yourself a nutritionist, but some of us have done a little bit more than that than others certainly to be working in that elite environment. So it was after 2016, I moved down to London, and I started working with a couple of teams. Really started working with a company called Science and Sport, nutrition company. In my role there, they would kind of put me out to certain athletes. So I got some experience with Team Sky, USS Cycling, various different football teams. It was really, really good, really exposed me into new environments and different people and different athletes and understanding how different people work, because I was kind of really focused on football at that time. Then 4.5 years ago, set up my own company, and that was really kind of focusing on elite teams. So did some work with some Millwall Football Club for a couple of years. Started work with Birmingham City Football Club, which I still work with now for the last 4 years. Did some work in elite rugby union for a team called Harlequins, which, you know, if you're a fan of rugby union, it's one of the biggest teams in Europe. Since the 2 years ago, started with a Formula One team, which was a huge kind of culture shock for me. But again, it's just more learning, particularly around that travelling side of things. And since the start of this year, I left Harlequins and joined Brentford Football Club as their first team sports nutritionist. So I feel like I've been around and I've been exposed to various different environments and definitely learned a lot, all of which kind of shapes my philosophy that I try and implement today.
It's crazy. I think that the thing that is really, really cool about, you know, your story is how you just got dropped straight into the deep end with Hull. I think, you know, how you were staying in 2014 around this time, maybe 4 or so, you know, nutritionists in the Premier League. It's crazy that, you know, not many people were taking it seriously to the degree that they are today, and maybe it's not even enough.
It was crazy.
Whether they could even do.
I mean, they had a guy come in, and I still speak to him today, a guy called Shane Fairlove, who was a researcher out at Leeds, and he'd come in like 1 or 2 days a month, and basically my job was to implement what he was kind of giving me. And now I think that, imagine if I was going into, you know, my Premier League team 1 or 2 days a month, it'd be really hard to have that impact and develop those relationships. So I think it's definitely it's still growing. I think it's probably one of the fastest growing areas of sports science. Things like fitness coaching, strength and conditioning, GPS was a lot earlier. But certainly sports nutrition is getting bigger and bigger, and we're seeing more and more graduates every year. Unfortunately, you know, there's not enough jobs for the people graduating. It's really, really tough. But it definitely makes the certain individuals stand out, and that it is about the finer percentages.
Yeah, 100%. I think, as you said just then, even for the people, I know that in Australia, sports nutrition is massive, actually, for people just wanting to do degrees, but finding a career in that, it's very difficult because it's competitive, but also the lack of jobs for people. I think it's very difficult to have a full-time job in sports nutrition. I know that even in some of the football clubs that I've been at, not having a full-time sports nutritionist is a common thing, because you can't just neglect, let's say, or put aside hundreds of thousands of dollars for, you know, having a full team of, let's say, a chef, nutritionist, things like this. It's very difficult, and only in the top echelons of football teams where they can afford this can you really actually see that full nutrition team implemented. And I think obviously at Brentford, I've had a friend who was at Brentford for a few months on trial, and he was telling me the amazing things about you know, the chefs, the nutritionist. He's listening. He would definitely be listening to this episode, so shout out for him. But yeah, there was a lot of amazing stories that I heard, even just about the details to these small things, you know. But unfortunately, due to the not lack of funding, kind of lack of funding, but also the lack of, I guess, resources that are available to this important aspect of football, it makes that, you know, implementation of the finer details not as accessible to the clubs who are maybe lower down in the division. So, for example, for my current situation in my club, we don't have a sports nutritionist, but we have our strength and conditioning coach who is knowledgeable enough to give advice to the players. But it's definitely a very competitive and difficult area to get full-time work in. And that's why I think you see a lot of sports nutritionists taking on their own kind of business. And I know that in Australia, with the sports nutritionist that I was working with, from my own, like, I was reaching out to them. It was mainly through companies where they were all working together. I was working with some nutritionists from an app, and they were working with the PFA from Australia, and they were trying to get all the footballers to work this way, and it was just a bit more efficient for them because then they didn't have to go and have an office where they have to, pay for all these things. So they have to get creative to make it.
I think for me, that one-to-one developing the relationship is really, really important when it comes to food.
100%.
And certainly, like, there is no one-size-fits-all model when it comes to nutrition. Like, everybody's individual. You might even have some, people in the same position, the same weight, the same height, the same sort of physiological stats, but the way they approach things could be completely different. So that's something you've got to factor in with nutrition that, might be a little bit different to strength and conditioning, where a lot of teams will do kind of the same base 5 or 6 exercises. But certainly, like, nutrition they're the most individual thing I think out there. And I think it's very personal as well. Like, it's very, very personal. I think that's probably why you get barriers sometimes, is that everybody eats. Everybody has an opinion about nutrition. I think everybody gets nutrition advice, probably from the wrong places. Like, at the minute, things like TikTok, Instagram, it's an absolute nightmare, and it's a minefield. And there's people that look a certain way or play a certain way, and because they do that and they say they eat like this, all of a sudden everyone jumps onto that. And a big part of my job is trying to understand what works for the individual, because I've worked with hundreds of players at the elite level, and not one of them have done things the same as another player. I couldn't tell you one way, because we all burn different amount of calories. We have different ways that our gut works. We have different ways that we tolerate food during exercise. Some of us feel ill when we have an energy gel at half time. Some of us couldn't have more. They feel really hungry. And it's trying to find that way for that different person. So it is really hard. But there are kind of ways that, that we'll discuss that, there are places to start and places where you can learn about yourself and ways that you can individualize your own nutrition. And I'll try and point you in the right direction of where to go for that.
Yeah. It's, as you said, it's very individual for per person. And we've actually had a previous episode, just us as co-hosts, Val, me, and the other co-host, Charlie. We were talking about just personal anecdotes and experience of nutrition. For me, I am a very obsessive person, and so is Val, and so is Charlie. Unfortunately for me, I was the one who developed the eating disorder because of the obsessive nature. Very easy to do, though. But for those boys, it worked in their favor. And it's a very, very similar approach, but different results. And it's something that, from person to person, different results happen. And I mean, we may have been told the exact same information, right? But for me, it turned out completely different. And even something interesting with Val, with his nutrition company, he has his company called SIP, and it's I'd say a very unique approach to even just the protein marketplace. And I think, Val, if you want to give a bit of an introduction even on to where your approach of protein and digestion and things like this, because Val's company is, I'd say it's quite unique even in that aspect. So Val, if you want to give it a bit on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. I quickly want to touch base on a very specific thing Ted talked about just now, that we are all individuals, and we often see professional players diets or routines or what they have in their changing rooms in terms of what nutrition they can have. We see that through social media. And I would say, and I think Ted also touched base on it, we are all individual. We shouldn't try to copy anyone's diet out there because it may be working for them. And that's one personal experience I gained. I tried and errored a lot of things. I saw stuff on social media that I wanted to try out, and I had to experience for myself that it wouldn't work. And so basically, that's how I also came to the supplements industry. And it's a topic that I have a big interest in because I try to take care about my body. And so basically, with the current supplements or protein powders more specifically, which are out there, I personally have a big problem because I'm, one, lactose intolerant. I perceive that the perspective of the market is more focused on bodybuilding, getting buff. And we as endurance athletes need to work more on improving our athleticism or performance on the field, supplying us with nutrients that recover us, that help us in the further experience. So how's my company different in that sense? I've tried to think about how the athletes consume a protein powder. I am lactose intolerant. We do need protein in that sense, but I think we also need to consider more how our products, how do products affect athletes in particular? How is their digestion affected? What measures do we have in place to help their digestion? Because we have such modern diets, so many different ingredients per meal, per snack, whatsoever. Our body is constantly working. And as you guys mentioned, Nick, for example, has a different metabolism than mine. I am very lucky. I think I'm very lucky that my metabolism is very good. I can eat as much calories as I want because I also burn a lot, roughly 4,000 on a very high day. But as my friends, for example, I eat a lot, and they always ask me, why don't you gain weight or whatsoever? And I'm saying that out of my perspective, my metabolism is very good. And I think that's very unique to each player. Every player is individual. That's why also their supplements need to be individual. Maybe my product doesn't work for everyone, but that's okay because we are all individual. We all need to find something that works from yourself. And I've tried to break the market in terms of going away from the very lactose amounts that are currently present in the products. And I know many people out there have lactose intolerant problems, minor ones or whatsoever. They are very sensitive to protein powders. They get bloated, they have digestive issues, etc. So I am breaking that with my product in terms of guaranteeing no side effects. So that's just a little info about Scent.
I like that, but like you brought up some really interesting points there. The first one being metabolism, and I'm gonna kind of debunk that a little bit. I think some people do have sort of what they call as like a better metabolism than others. A lot of that can depend on your body type. So you might help. Everyone kind of remembers that kind of skinny friend that just eats everything and it just kind of doesn't put it on. Like, yeah, we can actually test for that. We can do tests that that analyze the gas, so analyze what we basically expend and the breathe out. It tells you how many calories you burn at rest. And one thing that you'll do is you could find, two similar athletes, both say 80 kilos, for example. You can stick them on the gas analysis machine and it will tell you that one player will burn 1,700 calories at rest and one player burns 2,000 calories at rest. It's really, really interesting. There are sums and equations that we can do to work it out and kind of make a good guesstimate of it that kind of have been shown that it is accurate within 5%. And to do that simple, I always use Omni calculator. It's quite good. So you can just Google RMR calculator Omni and it will come up and you type in your details on that and it'll tell you how many calories you burn at rest or when you're doing nothing. But yeah, some people do have a faster metabolism than others, but I think a lot of the times it's really not that complicated. It's some people think, oh, well, how come he can eat whatever he wants and not gain weight or build the muscle mass that he builds, when actually some people need to kind of break down their diet a little bit. There's some people might be gaining weight because they're eating excess sources. For the amount of calories that are like hidden in sources that people don't actually remember in their day-to-day consumption is crazy. People can easily hide 500-600 calories worth of sauce and add in sugar to coffee and things like that they just completely forget about when they think back about their diet. So I think metabolism definitely plays a key role in it, but also just reflecting on what you do and where the kind of hidden points are. If I ask any of you to do like almost like a 24-hour recall on what you had in the last 24 hours, there's tons of research out there to show that people underestimate what they actually think they had. I think that's kind of where people need to start when thinking about their diet, is recording what you do, and then what you're doing matching what you're doing based on your goal. So what is your goal first? Is it to lose weight, maintain weight, gain weight? What's your performance goal? Alongside that, is it to gain strength? Is it to get quicker? Is it to increase endurance? And then go from there. You've got to take those steps, but you've got to reflect on yourself as well. And I fully agree with the lactose in whey protein. I work with a lot of players that are lactose intolerant or have full-on allergies of lactose. So it is definitely a gap that people need to think about, because what's more important, hitting your protein goal or having an upset stomach afterwards? That is definitely something that we all need to look at. And I think every single person out there, not just athletes, have a form of intolerance, whether it be a sensitivity to gluten, which is a common one. Lactose is a hugely common one. And it's important that you reflect on your diet. Don't exclude things. There are tests that you can get, like IgA tests and things like that aren't 100% accurate. The best thing to do is say lactose, completely exclude it from the diet for a week, monitor how you feel, rate how you feel, and then slowly introduce that back into your diet. And again, monitor how you feel. If you find that your stomach changes and the way you're dealing with things changes, then you want to be looking at alternative options. But certainly by using a low lactose or no lactose protein powder, it definitely wouldn't hurt you. If anything, it could increase digestion, because a lot of times we don't get symptoms of sensitivities. And I would agree, we'd get better absorption from it.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that even the fact where you step, having that maybe lower lactate dose of protein source, that can actually help you perform better, which is exactly what we talk about at Sculpted, right? The reason why, a bit of background with getting Val on as a co-host, it was originally just myself and Charlie, and we wanted we ended up getting Val on because we really liked his approach to things, and we realized that his product in itself it's a perfect way to sculpt yourself, to get that little 1%. And again, it's Val and I both use Whoop. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. Probably are. But we track, everything through Whoop, these habits. For me personally, I'm also lactose intolerant. And I find that I am negative 8% on an average if I have, let's say, I think it's 5, whatever the measurement is for how many doses of lactose, basically. So on average, I'm negative 8% of my recovery. So yeah. So basically that's a massive component for myself. Obviously every single day I would have put my best foot forward, but let's say if I've had, some yogurt the day before, well, my recovery is compromised. I'm more susceptible to an injury now. Maybe I'm not as aware. My bloating is higher, everything like this. It's a very interesting take on, just sculpting yourself. And I think, again, this is why I wanted you on. It's a great way, because nutrition really can help you sculpt yourself better and better every single day. And that just to take it back onto another point about the BMR, so the basal metabolic rate. I had a DEXA scan a few years ago. I found out that my resting metabolic rate was around 1,700. And I know that a lot of people, right, who, I also have those friends, supposedly can eat anything that they want, and they just eat for days. But I also realized that, I also probably could be seen to, I would probably be seen to not eat so much, right? But there are things where it's like, okay, maybe I'm stacking more, and bringing that awareness to it of maybe I'm having higher caloric foods, or maybe I'm overeating, and these things where I know that in Australia, there's, maybe as an Australian myself, I know the stereotype, but Australians are typically in pretty good shape. I say they're above the average human being in relatively good shape. And a lot of my friends from Australia, I would say they're absolute freaks when it comes to their physique, just naturally, right? They are lean freaks, and it's crazy. But I also realize that their lifestyle has a massive component of their supposed metabolism. They say that they've got rapid metabolism. Originally, I thought that as well, and I was thinking, why am I the one who's, not that I was overly overweight, but I wasn't as lean as them. And I was thinking, why didn't I get this? And then I realized that, okay, well, some days these kids don't even eat anything, but on other days they eat thousands of calories, and they can actually afford to do that. But it's just a perception of, their fast metabolism, and it's without lifestyle.
We're dealt genetic cards. Everybody is dealt genetic cards, but you can change those cards by what you do. That's really, really important to know. Like, technically, you look at your parents, that's, if you kind of do what they do, then you're going to end up like them, physically, even health-wise, but you can change those cards. That's really, really important to think about by working at it. And that's where I think people really struggle because they've been born a certain way. You've got half of your mum, half of your dad, but you can change that, and it's really, really important.
Yeah. So let's go on to kind of the first topic that we want to talk about. So with fueling for, an event, for training, things like this is something that's important for athletes. As we've said, we want to get the best out of every single day, every training session. So maximizing results, recovery, things like this. For me currently, I guess a good anecdote is I'm not fueling at all. This is my new strategy. So I've gone from, fueling and obsessing over each training session with eating the right amount of food, where now live fueling time is in a 4-hour window every single day. So I'm doing 20-hour fasts, 4 hours of an eating window. For me, it's something completely new. I don't know if it's working for me yet. I don't know if it's still working for me yet. It's just something that's new for me. I'm working along with my strength and conditioning coach, as I mentioned, but this is a new strategy for myself. But if we talk about ways that fueling for recovery and things like this, if we just get into depth about that, that'll be
I think
good place to start.
well, I don't mean to undermine the diet that you're doing, but like from my opinion, from what I've seen, and also what the research suggests as well, is that players are under fueling, and that compromises everything performance related. And I think that's what I focus on. I focus on performance, and that is making people play better. Now, it's not to say that, what you're doing isn't right, because what you're doing is probably creating a calorie deficit, which in the long term may drop body fat that then may make you a better player. But right now, if you were to play, 90 minutes, you would be underfueled for what you do. And when that happens, what are the side effects of that? Certainly for a keeper, it is reaction time is significantly decreased. Sprint time is decreased. Endurance capacity is significantly decreased. I mean, even the old school Gatorade, Lucozade adverts, just one guy running on a treadmill with water, one guy running on it with carbohydrate fueled. The guy running with carbohydrate is going to run faster, and he's going to run for longer, because there's one reason for it. It's physiologically our makeup as repeated sprint sport and power athletes, with that kind of side hustle of being an endurance. It's a weird makeup, but that is fueled by carbohydrate. And carbohydrate fuels those actions, and particularly winning actions. Even if we look at the World Cup, okay, you look at when the goals were scored in the World Cup, it's a stat. It's like 30 to 40% of them are scored in the last 10 minutes of the game. It's mental. Like, why is that? Why do you think that is? Tell me. What do you think? What
I reckon.
Go on.
I think, let's say, I'm thinking in terms of the topic of today's episode. I think let's say one team is caring about the minor details less than the other, if that makes sense. So let's say if the team who is scoring those goals or the team who is conceding those goals, maybe their approach is different to the other team in terms of longevity or even a strategic aspect. So let's say the coaches, getting the better players on towards the end of the game or vice versa. I think that there could definitely be a few reasons. We have to know
a few reasons, tactically being one of them. But from my perspective, what you do fueling-wise affects that last 10 minutes of a game. And people don't think of it like that. People just think, I feel fine at half-time. I don't need to take anything. I'll just sip water. But you've actually got to think about how you feel in the last 10 minutes. Now, physiologically, we can store enough carbohydrate in our muscles to last around, different for different people, but 70, maybe 80 minutes of high intensity exercise. That might be less for some people, it might be a little bit more for some people. But on average, around that 70, 80 minute mark. So if you were to consume nothing during that game, that's assuming that you have carbohydrate loaded the day before, increase your carbohydrate stores, up to kind of 7 grams of carbs per kilo of body mass the day before. And that's not to say that at 70 minutes, 80 minutes, you just drop off and just can't run anymore, but certainly your physical capacity will be decreased. So that is why carbohydrates are really, really, really important for footballers, because they fuel what you do. It's not like endurance exercise, it's not like marathon running where you've got a high proportion of that exercise fueled by fat. We are literally 80-90% carbohydrate dominant athletes. So really, there isn't really any argument around the kind of that is why carbohydrates and fueling are important for performance. But that's really focusing on match day. There are probably, negative aspects of constantly fueling carbohydrate all the time throughout the training week. And that comes from like an adaptation perspective. So sometimes you've got to stress the body during training. You've kind of got to teach the body to basically work a little bit of other fuel sources, to use protein as a fuel source, BCAAs as a fuel source, fat as a fuel source. But certainly when it comes down to that performance, when you want to perform the best, that's fueled by carbohydrate. So that's something really, really important. And really, to me, there's no argument of that. So that's one thing I'll say to you, like you're undergoing like fasting at the minute, which is fine. Like I'm personally a big fan of intermittent fasting. I think it's a really good technique to put somebody in a calorie deficit because, you might be trying to drop body fat. But if you do that too much, or if you do that all the time, then you're actually probably going to decrease your performance because your body's going to get used to doing that all the time and you're going to be underfueled during that match day. So maybe a better way of doing it would be to do it on days off. It could be to do it on lower intensity training days. But certainly when you have a double session day on a Tuesday or a really hard day on a Thursday, that would be when I would change it and I would start fueling with carbohydrate, because that's when you've got to be doing outputting. And another reason why I would fuel with carbohydrate during training, certainly harder training sessions, is we get more quality out of it as well. So you might say you want to burn more calories, or you're doing sessions to try and burn more calories to drop body fat. If we fuel a little bit better for it, then potentially we'll have higher outputs and we could potentially burn more calories during that session. Whereas you probably know when you're really, really tired going into a session, sometimes it's just hard to do those extra bits. Is our movement quality decreased? Yes, it will be. So I think it's finding that balance of kind of what works, but certainly when it comes to match day, it should be fueled by carbohydrate because that is the main energy source for our brain and our muscles.
Yeah, 100%. And just to be clear for everyone listening, and even just Ted now, so my history with nutrition and everything like that, I've never, like for me, fasting and going without food for, less than 2 hours, it was like a completely foreign thing for me. I probably never even done it in my life. Like I was like so obsessed with even just getting a gram of carbohydrates in just to fuel the next bit of training for me, because it was having an eating disorder. You can be very obsessive, right? So my new approach, because I've always been trying to drop my fat percent for the past 4 years, right? And I've literally stayed the exact same fat percent for the past 4 years, even though I've tried to be in a caloric deficit. This is something very common for people with bulimia and obesa. But now switching it up, trying to be in a caloric deficit where I can get my fat percent to a standard for professional footballers. I'm sitting around the 18-19%. This is what I've literally been at for like my whole life, basically. And it's not overweight, but it's not standard for a professional footballer. So for me to get down to the standard for a professional footballer, for me, because I've been trying for 4 years, trying to do this different ways and haven't seen any results, trying to change the approach. And as I said, I don't know if it's working yet because I've only been doing it for a few weeks. I don't know if it's the right approach going forwards or not, but this is what I have to figure out, if it's going to work for me or if it's not going to work for me. And as you said, there will be training sessions where I'm going in tired. I mean, even for example, this morning I rocked up to training and I rock up at 7:30 a.m. I get told that training's at 11 a.m. I thought that originally, I got told that it was at 8:15, and I'm thinking, okay, sweet, finished training, fasted, okay, it's not too bad, but then I'll have lunch afterwards and I'll be fine. And then I find out, okay, well, training's a lot later. I can't go home to eat. And now I'm going in with fasting for 22 hours, going into training, and I'm pretty tired. I'm pretty, I'm hungry. But I think that for me, especially, that comes as a challenge itself, Yes, I am not fatigued, but I'm not as present as I would be if I was fueled. And I kind of had to switch it a little bit because I knew that this was going to be an issue for me, as I found out the training was a bit later. But thankfully, I was able to just switch it a little bit. you can obviously still see differences in your performance. I actually find that I get very cold, which I find is a common thing for people who are fasting for 20 to 24 hours or even longer than that. You literally just start to get cold. I was here the other day on my rest day. I wanted to do a 24-hour fast. No one told me to do it. I just tried it myself, and I was speaking to Val about this actually. But I actually got very cold, and yeah, it was quite surprising. And again, it's not something that I advise doing to everyone, not even anyone. I'd say it's just my approach currently right now that I'm doing. And I don't know if it's working or not. I don't know if it will work for me, but I think that the most important thing is doing it under guidance.
Every diet has the same kind of end goal, and that is when we're talking about dropping body fat. But every single diet, whether it be intermittent fasting or just skipping one meal, it could be just reducing carbohydrates, for example, going carb free, all equals the same amount, and that is just reducing calories. So
Calories are best calories.
Exactly, that's the only way to drop body fat. There is no supplement that can drop body fat. There is not cutting out any one macronutrient or micronutrient will not burn body fat. Training fasted will not burn body fat. It'll enhance the way that you use body fat as a fuel source. But is that good for a footballer? Probably not, because you use carbohydrate as a fuel source. But fasting is just one approach. For me, I think, obviously you tried a couple of different ways to, get in a calorie deficit, and that's why you went to this one. I'd always start a little bit kind of differently. So maybe you'd start just by reducing the amount of fat in your diet. The reason for that, fat is obviously really important to help us recover. It's really important sort of aspect cellular in our body. But when we think about the energy of fat, that a gram of protein contains 4 calories, a gram of carbohydrate contains 4 calories, but a gram of fat contains 9 calories. By reducing, it's almost like triple the energy in fat compared to protein and carbs. So by reducing that, it reduces our overall calorie intake. That's usually a good place to start. Second would be reducing the amount of carbohydrates in our diet and assessing whether you're having too much. The reason for that is that carbohydrates are usually things that are over-consumed quite typically. It's quite easy to over-consume carbohydrates, especially as an athlete, because you kind of crave it a little bit. So it's a good thing to assess that, track it. Are we having too much? And then next stop would be to look at, potentially, skipping one meal, or trying to just, leave out dinner one evening as a way to, reduce the calorie intake. And then obviously you're on the kind of extreme end where you're just eating within a 4-hour period. Not to say that's not wrong, but certainly there are ways that I would go, steps I would take first before I get to your step. I think that's important to say for anyone listening.
Yeah, 100%. And just so the listeners also know, I've also probably taken all of those steps, unfortunately, but I've almost come to one of the last strings for me, and it's this. But there is a very, very large mental aspect towards the nutrition strategy as well, because for me, calorie counting was something I did for a long time, and I know that a lot of people do calorie count, and for me, that's something that did not help at all. It led to a lot of binge eating, and I know that for Charlie, our other co-host, calorie counting works to him, but it might, as I said, for me, it doesn't work. Do you actually advise calorie counting for most players, or is it something that you try to steer away from, because athletes typically are more susceptible to eating disorders than the average person, I believe?
Correct, yeah. So I'm not a huge fan of calorie counting. I'd always take an individual approach. If someone really likes it, then great, but it wouldn't be somewhere that I start. I think, the way I would start is just by assessing, what's gone on with their diet, what's gone on physiologically for the last couple of months. So I'd probably take a couple of weigh-ins, take body composition analysis over a period of time, and be like, okay, well, you're fairly stable at the minute. Maybe they're in a bit of a plateau. So we could safely say that calories in are equaling calories out. And then we'd maybe look to just add additional calories if they're trying to gain, or we'd look to just remove 200 to 300 calories a day if they're looking to reduce. Whereas if they have high fluctuations in their body mass, and we see, it's almost coming in differently, then we've got to go things a little bit differently. And that's when we've got to try and really kind of dive into the calories, because it might be very, very different on different days, but it kind of should be. And I know we'll go on to it in a minute around that periodization, but I think that is where our diet should go as footballers, that we should periodize our diet, just like we do our training, just like we do our recovery. We shouldn't eat the same thing on every single day. That's really important. And I think sometimes we get into habits. And I think that a lot of people listening now will probably be thinking, I pretty much have the same breakfast every day. Like, I have the same omelette every day. I have the same lunch every day. Maybe I have the same protein bar every day and the same shake every day. But actually, when you think about the exercise that you do, that changes completely. Sometimes we're burning, for example, on an off day, Val, you're probably burning 2,000 calories. You're probably, if that, you're probably just chilling because you're recovering. Whereas, like you mentioned, that when you're on a hard training day, you're burning up to 4,000 calories. And we should change our nutrition to adapt that on a daily basis. So a lot of the times, when I devise a nutrition plan and somebody wants like a day-to-day nutrition plan, I don't really go day by day. What I'll do is I'll split up based on sessions. So say if we have like a rest day nutrition, like 4 example rest days, 4 example light training days. So it could be like level 1 or like an RP of up to 4. We might have like a double day, a match day -1, and a match day, because they're completely different. And that's where I think people should start thinking. I think that's where I think people could sculpt themselves better into better athletes, but by going along with that periodized nutrition route. The way to periodize it, calories are obviously the number one thing you've got to think about. Calories in, you've got to equal calories out if you're looking to maintain, or you've got to be getting into a surplus if you're looking to gain strength and gain weight, because that's going to help your body adapt to the stimulus that you're giving it. Then you want to kind of be dropping down into the macronutrients. And I think that's often where people start with macronutrients, when actually they should be thinking about calories first. So when we think about our 3 main macros, we've got protein, carbs, and fat. Protein for a footballer should largely, be fairly similar. As a general range, you're looking at around about that higher end, so around about that kind of 2 grams of protein per kilo of body mass per day. So the larger you are, the more protein you need to support your muscles. On off days, you might want to go a little bit higher. It's particularly if you're injured, you might want to go even higher as well, because we're reducing our overall energy intake, and that is all about having your muscles adapt to the stimulus, and also having them recover effectively. But that 2 grams per kilo for me is the sweet spot. So that's 160 grams of carbohydrate, 160 grams of protein for like an 80 kilo athlete. And it's important that you reflect on what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. Key things that I usually see that are poor are usually at breakfast. I think you've got to be nailing that protein at breakfast. I think a lot of people wake up, have like toast or cereal. And actually, we're thinking about muscle protein balance. You're waking up after 7 or 8 hours without eating. You're going to be in a negative protein balance. Your muscles are going to be what's called catabolizing. So you're losing that muscle. And when we eat sufficient amount of protein, it's called anabolism. So it's going up. We'll go to a positive protein balance. And we want to try and maintain a positive protein balance as much as we can. And that is trying to have protein little and often throughout the day, every single main meal and between meals also. And that's where like supplements can help, because a football player, they need more protein than an endurance athlete and a regular person. And it's really hard to hit that 2 grams per kilo on a daily basis, particularly post-exercise, where we get like what we call like the window, which is where blood is pumping around your body, your muscles act as like a sponge to absorb those branched-chain amino acids, and that protein is going to help your body recover better. You can do it through food, but usually after exercise, people are a little bit, aren't really hungry. So that's where I think protein shakes are fantastic, something that I use with pretty much every single athlete that I work with, because I know it's really hard to hit those protein goals. To start there, your carbohydrate in terms of periodization should be the main thing that we change, because carbs fuel performance. So it's really important that when we're not performing, we're not fueling up with carbohydrates. So like days off and things like that, our carbohydrate should come down. That's going to reduce our calorie intake down, and we're not going to be over consuming calories on those off days. And that's usually where I think people get it wrong, and where people really struggle with gaining body fat. They're usually over-consuming calories and carbohydrate on those off days. That doesn't mean you're not allowed like treats. I think everybody should have treats in their diet and have what you like, whether that be going out for meals and enjoying it with friends. But like, when's the best time to have treats and over-consume and indulge? It's on days when you work hard. It's on those days. It's on the match days. It's on those double session days. It's on those days when you burn 1,600 active calories, because your body is going to deal with those calories completely different. If anything, it'll help you recover, because that's important. Sometimes calories in got to equal those calories out, and sometimes doing it via treat, it's important for your head as well. I'd never be one to say no. Sometimes you take an athlete's diet and completely rearrange things around, and it just completely work better for them because they're having treats on better days. They're going a little bit easier on their off days, but they're kind of over-consuming a little bit on those training days and match days, and we see better performances, we see better recovery, and they're still enjoying what they like eating. But yeah, carbohydrates are the main things we should be manipulating when periodizing. So carbohydrates, mainly starchy carbohydrates, is what we try and manipulate. So things like pastas, rices, potato, bread, things like that. Things that really, really high in carbohydrate. Reduce them on those days that you're not working. Increase them on those days when you are working. A little example could be at breakfast. So say if you really like having an omelette, all right, let's give that as an example. On a day off, you might just have an omelette with one slice of toast, and you might have like maybe a protein yogurt on the side, something like that. So relatively low in carbohydrate, 30 grams from the bread. Whereas how might we adapt that on a training day? Well, it could be that you have your omelette, but you have 2 slices of toast. It might be that you still have your yogurt, but you add a little bit of granola to it. You might have a side of orange juice, like fresh orange juice. All of a sudden, we've taken the same meal, we've adapted it, so it's now got 100 grams of carbohydrate in. And now that's going to help us fuel our performance better. And it's going to give us those extra calories to support performance and recovery. Sometimes just have a look at what you do on a day-to-day basis and how could you adapt it based on the demands of what you're doing. So I hope that's a good overview of periodization. But if there's one thing that any player gets out of this today, it will be that.
That was amazing. There was so much out of that, just that past few minutes. So, like, what we always do is we make like summary sheets for our listeners, and obviously clips to the podcast. That just there will be a lot of clips and summary sheets, because there is so much, very applicable things for everyone, just to take out of that. So that being said, Val, if you have any thoughts, any questions, we'd love to hear what you've got to say.
Yeah, so basically what Ted just said, brilliant stuff. I have a controversial perspective on the protein intake. As Ted mentioned, many people often skip the breakfast protein intake, and they tend to grab something, for example, cereal or Nutella toast or whatever, some quick carbs and high sugars, for example. So I basically give the statement of we basically consume too much protein per serving. That's why many people get bloated, or they have the feeling of their digestion is maybe very heavy. That's what I experienced in the past. But I'm also saying we should hit the protein goal of our daily example, like you mentioned. So if a guy is 80 kilos, one should try to hit their 160 grams. What I'm meaning with that is that we try to split it up in all of our meals and all of our snacks. That's why, for example, in breakfast, you should directly start off the morning with a protein grams. Or, for example, in a snack, have a protein snack, something like a protein shake, like a protein bar, eggs, boiled eggs, I don't know, whatever. But I tend to believe that we get a lot of problems from overeating too much protein per serving. That's what I've experienced by myself. And I don't know what's your take on that, but maybe you could also give the listeners out there some practical tips. We've now talked a lot about the theoretical stuff, but what would be some low-hanging fruits people can adapt immediately? Like, for example, they have a high training day and they maybe still go to school in terms of a young athlete. How can they immediately impact their performance during training with maybe a carb example that you can give, or a post-training example of maybe a protein food or ingredients that they can have the access to, which they can take immediately from this podcast, because I think many people don't have the knowledge of what could work, or there's too much out there, like you mentioned at the beginning. Through social media, we get a lot of influence. What would be one practical tip for during training and after?
Okay, yeah, well, start with the protein, because I think that's probably a hot topic. But yeah, no, I fully agree with you about splitting up, and I think, yeah, you can over-consume protein in one sitting. It's a bit of a myth to say you can't absorb protein. Some people say you can't absorb more than 30 grams of protein in one sitting, but that's not correct. But certainly from a digestion perspective, yes. I think that it is a, it's a big, it's bulky, it increases satiety, so it makes you feel full. That's what protein does. So trying to get the little and often approach is really, really important. And yeah, like I said, people struggle, and certainly young athletes really struggle to have it at breakfast. I mean, there's some professional players I work with right now that are 20, 21, that still struggle to have it at breakfast. And from an overall development perspective, that's really, really important. But that's where I think that, I mean, I remember when I was a young athlete, and I just used to wake up and I was not hungry. So it's really, and I would, my 16-year-old self would say to me, yeah, I know I should have protein, but I'm not hungry in the morning. So what do I do? And that's a fair enough point. I can't make somebody hungry. But it's about being prepared. Often I'll go to school, and at about 10 o'clock in the morning, I was starving, and I didn't have anything, I didn't prep anything. Sometimes I'd eat my lunch early, so it is about preparing, knowing your body, know what you're going to go into. I'm a big fan of using smoothies. One thing I wish I did, when I was younger, was prepare a smoothie and take it with me in there and just have it in my bag. That would be huge. And certainly, I find the liquid carbohydrates and liquid protein a lot easier to get down and quite enjoyable as well. So that could be something like 300 mils of kind of your choice of milk, whether that be a dairy version or a non-dairy version, almond milk, coconut milk. Could be 20 grams of protein, so some protein powder in there, like a chocolate one. You could add a banana, tablespoon of peanut butter, maybe a little bit of spinach in there. Give it a whiz up. You've got a really nice chocolate banana peanut butter shake. That's going to give you at least 30 grams of protein hit. It's going to give you at least 50 grams of carbohydrate. It's also going to help hydrate you as well. And I would just get and I work with a young athlete at the minute, not in football. He's a racing driver, and he really struggles to have eat breakfast in the morning. And that's been a big thing for him, is that waking up, and he really enjoys it. At the start he's like, I'm not hungry, I don't eat until 12, and that was a big tick box for him. It could be jumping on things like a protein bar is really good, and I know a really good alternative to chocolate. It could just be taking in some an overnight oats. It's something as easy as you could do so. Quite simply, 20-30 grams of oats, top it up with some milk of your choice, or a little bit of yogurt. You can use dairy-free yogurt as well, or soy yogurt. Stir in a tablespoon of protein powder, add some berries in there, a little bit of honey, leave it in the fridge to set overnight. It's ready. It's almost like a really nice flavored kind of porridge with added fruit that can just sit in your bag for at least 2 hours, and you can kind of start to have it in your first lesson or whatever. It's about preparing, and it's about preparation of, don't think about how you feel at that time, think about how you're going to feel in 2 hours. And that's with every single athlete, whether that just be preparing in the morning or preparing for, at half time in a match. Think about how you're going to feel at the end, not how you feel in that situation. So that's kind of my main piece of advice there. When we're talking about carbohydrates, onto the next one, again, it comes down to preparation. I mean, I think athletes need to really take ownership of it. And a young student athlete should be, if they can tell their parents what to buy them and what to prepare for them, but ideally take ownership of your own performance. I think all ages, if you really want it, you've got to seek it, because parents and guardians don't always know that's the best thing for you to have, and that's probably why your audience are listening to this right now, because they want to get better. So if you've got a session after school, say if you finish school at 4 p.m. and you've got an hour's drive to training, your last meal was probably at lunchtime. Should you really go 4 or 5 hours without eating and then train, and then actually your next meal is going to be at dinner at 7 o'clock. Like, that's not going to help your performance. What can you take with you that's just easy and kind of ticks those fueling goals for you to have kind of when you drive to training at 4 o'clock? So it could be things like fruits are ideal. You know, it's giving you your vitamins, it's giving you carbohydrates, like a banana. It could be like an oat bar. Over here we've got like Nature Valley bars and energy bars. There's so much of them. Try and go for more like oat-based bars and bakes that's going to give you that carbohydrate without kind of fueling you with chocolate and refined sugar and things like that. You know, it could be things like Squares bars, banana loaf. You know, there, if you like Google like performance like recipes like homemade energy bars and homemade protein balls, there are so many solutions now that we can find. It's just kind of knowing where to look for them. And so I always use recommend like BBC Good Food over here in the UK. I'm sure you guys can find it where you are, and they've got so many kind of recipes on there. Whether you just type in like meal prep or snack prep, and it'll give you so many ideas that'll help you fuel towards your performance.
I mean, again, there's so many, you know, amazing ways that we could take action from that. You know, as you mentioned, taking accountability for your nutrition is something that's very important. Obviously, parents, they might not be completely educated in this area. They might not be completely, let's say, even involved, or they might not see a relevance or importance in it. And I know that in Germany, from living with different families, it really does vary from house to house even. I know that from some houses that I've been at, and I'm sure Val can vouch for this as well. In Germany, they love their bread and Nutella in the morning. And being from Australia, when I saw this reverse side, I couldn't believe it. I thought it was a joke, because in Australia, it's like, oh, okay, well, it's bacon and eggs and toast, and you know, that's the typical Aussie breakfast, or it's just cereal. And yeah, very, very toughless.
It's really hard, especially when you're in, like, we call it digs over here, where you're in like funded accommodation by the club, and actually like they'll get given money to spend on you on meals. And from my experience, like sometimes the host families will spend as little as possible so that they can then keep some of that money, and that's quite
almost the process.
And that's something that I know the clubs over here are trying to really educate the host families on. Because yeah, you could just be given like some bread and just some toast for breakfast, come back and have like a microwave meal. It's quite common. And then it's about like, you know, if that does happen to you, and you're in a good situation of being looked after by a professional club, like, again, you've got to speak to someone first, somebody at the club. Can you get a little fridge in your room? What kind of snacks can you get? What can you kind of take home from the club from a meal prep perspective? But it is really, really challenging. I know what you mean.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, in Germany, we are thankfully not too many clubs do a host family. They typically do a thing called an internat, which is like a football boarding school. So typically, they have all of the nutrition provided by nutritionists on campus, which is quite convenient. I think it's a good way of doing it. Definitely minimizes, you know, those bad experiences that players in digs could definitely have. I know even from personal experiences that some of my friends have had in England with actually having host families who have actually literally made that player move to a different club because the home club wasn't actually taking that seriously enough, and this player actually moved to another club because of that. So again, it's just reiterating the importance and you know, all these things about how nutrition is very impactful in football.
Yep.
Yeah, lots of different anecdotes for everyone, and it's completely individual to the person, as I've said this whole episode. And being cautious of the time here, I just want to check, Val, is there anything that you wanted to touch on before we wrap up the last few questions for Ted?
One last thing. So basically, as Nick already mentioned, accountability towards your own nutrition. I believe out of my own experience from the past, still being in school, I know the example. You come to school, maybe in the morning you didn't want to have some bigger breakfast, you eat some quick carbs, and now you're at lunchtime. what do you eat then? Many people don't bring something to school. They maybe eat in the cafeteria or whatsoever. I personally started to take my own food to school. And this is a very practical and easy tip. Being prepared is key. Very easy. Take or ask your parents, for example, to make one extra portion in the night, and you just take this with you. This is a quick solution for being prepared, because most of the times you don't want to spend any more money. You're not allowed to go off campus. Maybe you don't have food at all, and then you starve yourself until later. And in those moments, I believe that the temptation to go for something quick, counterproductive for your performance, is very high. So that's my final point.
This is exactly where I'd go as well, to be honest. And I used to take my own food in. And I never used to eat in the canteens at school. But yeah, best way to do it is pure meal prep. And it's actually really, really cost efficient as well. And a lot of people think it's like, no, like, they'll happily spend £3-4 a day on a school lunch that is nutritionally horrendous. But you could cut that in half and probably get a lot more just by making it at home, or like making an extra portion and taking it in. I fully agree.
Yeah, top advice. That being said, Ted, for our last question, we just want to go over 3 ways that you yourself sculpt yourself on a daily basis, or ways you see or help players sculpt themselves on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think myself is a tough one. Like, I always, like, probably personally, like, I always try and run every day, and I think like exercise is so important for me, just mentally, and like I don't think I'd have any energy, or even days when I don't exercise, like I just don't feel great in myself. And I think it's really hard to be a nutritionist and provide advice if I'm not kind of doing it myself a little bit. That's more of like a personal thing, but I think relationships is everything for me, and everywhere that I work and everybody I work with, like it's about developing relationships and putting people first before athletes. And I think that you don't need to be a nutritionist working in a club to take something from that. And I think that even if you're an athlete, the relationships that you build in the team that you're at, with the players that you play with the coaches, with the people looking after you, that determines how you are as a person. And I know for a fact that when a team signs a player, like how they are as a person and how they develop relationships and how they put themselves in the changing room plays a huge impact on them actually joining that team. Like I know 100% about it. There's been times in the past where I've been asked by a manager, "Oh, you've worked with that player before. What's he like? Would he fit in here?" Like 100%. So like me personally, like trust is everything. Building relationships is everything in what I do, but it should also be kind of what I think everybody does in sport, because it's so competitive, and you've got to get lucky, and you've got to have talent, but you can also be a good person as well. That's really, really important. But I think that's kind of like I'll say that as point 1 about myself. I think like in terms of me and my practice, like I want the player to know that I'm here to guide them. Like I would never tell someone like what to eat. I think that's really, really poor practice from my perspective. My aim is to develop like autonomous athletes, and that's part of my philosophy. Like I want to be able to give them the tools for them to kind of make their own choices. So like I don't really believe in like some professional clubs do like table service, and they have to order through an app, and they're only allowed to choose certain foods based on their goals. But I don't believe in that. I believe in players making their own decisions. And when I look over and I see a player has made the right decision, they've taken what I've said and they've done it themselves, I see that as a huge win, because I know they've learned something, and that's kind of everything. And I think the final one for me is 100% finding like a balance with nutrition. Like I've seen a lot of nutritionists make mistakes, and probably same with strength and conditioning coaches as well, is that they go like 100% nutrition. Like you've got to be really strict and you've got to be like this. Like definitely not. I think always follow at least the kind of 80-20 rule, and that's like 80%, good, clean nutrition, and doing it the best that you can, thinking about performance and making the right choices. But that extra 20% is really important. That might be 10, it might be 5% for some people, it might be 1% for you, Nick, because you're quite strict in the way you do things. But definitely at least 20%. That could be if you like having if chocolate's your thing, and you like having a couple pieces of chocolate every single night. Like, it's not going to kill you, but if actually it helps you relax and helps you chill and makes you feel good, then that's a big win in terms of nutrition. If you man, I've seen some teams like ban sauces and have no sauce available, and I'm like sat there like, come on, like it's literally 2% of your plate. Like, if that's your thing, get the rest of your plate right and have that 20% up to you. I definitely just find that balance between like performance and health. Health is really, really important. And certainly for like a long-term athlete that you want to be, don't just, think I've got to do all these like quick fixes that could damage health, but may increase performance in the short term. Like, put health first and performance will come off the back of that. Like, good athletes are healthy athletes. That's really, really important.
Yeah, brilliant points. And I think that, those three things that you mentioned there, it's great to hear everyone's individual ways that they are used to sculpt themselves or to sculpt others. And Ted, thank you so much for today. We really appreciate your time. It was an excellent episode for us to even just learn all these new ways to, take accountability, take action. I think the main thing for us listeners to take away from this episode is, the accountability and, taking things into your own heads, because at the end of the day, nutrition, there's a lot of power in, taking accountability for your nutrition, because there are 1%ers, there are 2%ers. Nutrition can take up a lot of the performance ratio. And yeah, that being said, Ted, again, we really appreciate the time today, and I hope that all the listeners have learned a lot and they can take away and start acting on some of the things we've talked about today.
That was a great chat, guys. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Brilliant.